this morning. We have been, as a church, following a reading schedule that takes us from the beginning of the Bible in January to the end of the Bible in December. And as we stand here the first Sunday in September, we have gotten to the book of Ezekiel. If you were here last week, we heard a little bit from Ezekiel, and we'll hear from Ezekiel this week, and probably next week, the sermon will fall there too. This is one of the few books that's long enough that if we're going to be going through the entire Bible and keeping on that pace, and the sermons keeping on that schedule, this is one of the few books that will hit 3 weeks in a row. The book of Ezekiel is a book written by Ezekiel about his time and his experience as a prophet. Ezekiel is a man who lived not in Israel, at least for most of his life. Ezekiel is part of the generation that was carried off from Jerusalem when Jerusalem was conquered by Babylon. His entire ministry, as detailed in this book, happens in Babylon. So he is a man away from his country. He is a man among people of his country that have been exiled from their country, taken away from there. And he's a man who you would expect to have great words of comfort for his people. After all, they've just been through something devastating in their experience. They've just had the judgment of God poured out on them, as the previous prophets had told the people. The Assyrians, really the Babylonians, conquering the southern kingdom, conquering Jerusalem, was God's judgment on the people. So you would expect that after that judgment had been executed, we'd come to Ezekiel, and Ezekiel would have encouraging things to say, and good things to say, and hope and future, and just great stuff. And Ezekiel does have an element of that. But the thrust of Ezekiel's book is, you're people who haven't learned the lesson. We saw last week in Ezekiel's commissioning that God explicitly tells Ezekiel, I want you to go and speak to these people. And God says, Ezekiel, if I had sent you to any other people, those people would listen to you. But I'm sending you to these people, and they may not be receptive to what you have to say. God says, these are rebellious people that I'm sending you to. And the scene that we'll see today in Ezekiel chapter 8 is an example of this. Ezekiel is in Babylon. Ezekiel, at the beginning of this chapter, has the elders of Israel and Judah come to him. This is a recurring feature in the book of Ezekiel. The elders come to Ezekiel to hear what God says through God's prophet who's among them. So the elders have come to Ezekiel's house. They're sitting there. They're waiting for Ezekiel to get a word from God about what issue we don't know. We're not told. And Ezekiel gets this vision. It's absolutely a fantastic sequence of events in this vision. It says that someone who looks like a man reaches out what looks like his hand. And we noted last week that when you start getting prophets saying it was kind of like this and it looked like this and not really committing and saying this is what it was, this is probably something that defies description. And this is probably something just so fantastic that Ezekiel doesn't even have the words to describe what's happening to him. He says, so this kind of man reached out his kind of hand and pulled me up by my hair, and I saw visions of Jerusalem. Now Jerusalem is 800 or 1,000 miles away from where he is. And this vision, as we'll see, certainly does not cast the people in a good light. If the people who are in Babylon with Ezekiel were carried off for rebelliousness, then this vision will show us that the people that left, the people that stayed in Jerusalem, didn't get to stay because they were any less rebellious toward God. Let's hear these words together. Ezekiel chapter 8. In the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day, while I was sitting in my house and the elders of Judah were sitting before me, the hand of the sovereign Lord came upon me there. I looked and I saw a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist down, he was like fire. And from there up, his appearance was as bright as glowing metal. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God, he took me to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the north gate of the inner court, where the idol that provokes to jealousy stood. And there before me was the glory of the God of Israel, as in the vision I had seen in the plain. Then he said to me, Son of man, look toward the north. So I looked, and in the entrance north of the gate of the altar, I saw this idol of jealousy. And he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The utterly detestable things that the house of Israel is doing here? Things that will drive me far from my sanctuary? But you will see things that are even more detestable. Then he brought me to the entrance of the court. I looked, and I saw a hole in the wall. He said to me, Son of man, now dig into the wall. So I dug into the wall and saw a doorway there. And he said to me, Go in and see the wicked and detestable things they are doing there. So I went in and looked, and I saw portrayed all over the walls all kinds of crawling things and detestable animals, and all the idols of the house of Israel. In front of them stood 70 elders of the house of Israel, and Jaazaniah, son of Shaphan, was standing among them. Each had a censer in his hand, and a fragrant cloud of incense was rising. He said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the darkness, each at the shrine of his own idol? They say, The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. Again he said, You will see them doing things that are even more detestable. Then he brought me to the entrance, to the north gate of the house of the Lord, and I saw women sitting there, mourning for Tammuz. He said to me, Do you see this, son of man? You will see things that are even more detestable than this. He then brought me into the inner court of the house of the Lord, and there at the entrance to the temple, between the portico and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces to the east. They were bowing down to the sun in the east. He said to me, Have you seen this, Son of man? Is it a trivial matter for the house of Judah to do the detestable things they are doing here? Must they also fill the land with violence and continually provoke me to anger? Look at them putting the branch to their nose. Therefore, I will deal with them in anger. I will not look on them with pity or spare them. Although they shout in my ears, I will not listen to them. Unless we think that these are empty words that this chapter ends with. In chapter 9, we see punishment brought on these people for what's described in chapter 8. And in chapter 10, we get this description of the glory of the Lord that came on the temple when Solomon dedicated it, being lifted off of the temple. And really God turning away from this place that was dedicated for his worship. So as we begin to meditate on this scene, as we begin to unpack, what does it mean that Isaiah saw these things? What did it mean to the people there? What does it mean to us today? Let's pause for a moment. Let's ask that God would be with us and help us to see these things. Lord God, thank you for this section of your word. And God, thank you that you show to Ezekiel what you show in here. Thank you for the word that you gave him to speak to his people. God, I pray that as we reflect on what we were doing back in the days of Ezekiel, I pray that as we reflect on the things that the people were doing, the word that you gave to Ezekiel, that you help us to see what that means to us today. God, I pray that you would show us some things that we didn't see before we walked in. I pray that you'd help us to understand things in a different way. God, most of all, I pray that when we see those things, when we understand those things, that it would cause us to turn our hearts towards you. That it would cause us to seek after you and to abandon the worship of anything else. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So, if you can imagine the scene that Ezekiel saw, and you can imagine the elders of Judah coming to Ezekiel for a word from God, and who knows what they were even expecting. But it seems to me that this would be close to the last thing that you would expect. Off in exile, going to the prophet God's faithfully put among you, and hearing this description of blatant idolatry happening back in Jerusalem. Ezekiel sees this vision, and the recurring theme, the recurring words that come in this are from this, I presume it's an angel, this guy who looks like a man, who looks like he's half fire and half metal. I'm not sure what to make of him. I assume he's an angel. And the angel's recurring words to Ezekiel are, do you see how terrible this is? But you're going to see something even worse than this. And as the chapter progresses, Ezekiel sees the people setting up an idol in front of the temple of God. This place that's designated for the worship of the one true God, the one and only God. The people say, hey, things aren't going quite right. Maybe we'll set up an idol in the front court, and we can pay a respect to this idol as we walk in, and then we'll go in and worship the Lord. And Ezekiel sees the priests. And in the description here, we get this guy with the funny name, Jaazaniah, son of Shaphan. If he's described here as the son of Shaphan, he's one of the priests who's supposed to be leading the worship in the temple. So the priest who is in charge of leading worship of God in the temple has with him in the inner courts of the temple these other priests, and they're burning incense to other gods. They're worshiping other gods even in the middle of God's temple. And as it goes on, we get this description in 14 and 15 of something that is completely foreign to us. It says these women are mourning for Tammuz. This is, again, just another pagan practice held outside the temple. Where these women are happens to be the furthest into the temple that women were allowed to go. So they're as close to where the center of it that they could be. They're in the place where they would go to worship God. And here they are, engaging in this pagan practice. And even in the inner court of the temple, even beside the altar here, you get the priests who are supposed to minister in the holiest place. And you get the priests who are designated. They're the only ones that can go into this place. And what do we find here? Ezekiel has shown that the priests with their back to the temple. That's still not a good thing today, is it? If I were to attempt to preach here with my back turned towards you, some of you would be offended by that, and rightly so. And here are these priests with their back toward the temple, worshiping the sun that God created instead of the God that created the sun. Everything here is backwards. Everything here is wrong. Everything in this scene is completely detestable. The people who are supposed to be charged with guarding the worship of God and leading the people to worship, the people who are supposed to be the holiest people, the people who are set apart from among the other people so that they can serve in the temple, these people that have to follow this specific set of rules to maintain their fitness for ministry, to maintain their cleanliness so they don't make the temple unclean. These are the very people who take that role, who take that position and use it not just to promote, not just to tolerate, but to engage themselves wholeheartedly in this worship of gods who are gods. We read in Jeremiah, and it's an idea that we encountered as far back as Kings and Chronicles, that when the people run after these gods who are not gods, run after these worthless idols, that they in fact become worthless themselves. And the idea builds off of this, that you become like what you worship. You take on some of the characteristics of who you're worshiping. And so if you're worshiping something that's worthless, the people become worthless. And so after Ezekiel is shown this vision of idol worship in the very place that's reserved for the worship of God, the very place where God's presence dwells, as a covenant with Israel, as a sign to everyone around that God has chosen Israel. After Ezekiel sees this scene, he sees another scene. And in chapter 9, we get a description of God's punishment on some of these idolaters, that many of them are killed outright. And in chapter 10, as a direct result of what's going on, not just in chapter 8, but really for hundreds of years leading up to chapter 8, in chapter 10, God finally takes his presence away from the temple. Now, we heard about the dedication of the temple several months ago. We heard about what it meant that Solomon made this temple, and the description that we got there, both in Kings and Chronicles, of when God's presence comes into the temple, was just had a striking feature. And that striking feature was, it says that when God's presence came into the temple at that dedication, came into the temple for the first time, that the temple was so full of God's presence that there really wasn't even room for anyone else to go in. It's hard for me to stretch my mind around what that means, that the place is so full of God's presence that you can't go in. I could picture a place so crowded with people that you wouldn't go in. I probably wouldn't go in far before the point where I got so crowded that you couldn't go in. That would be too uncomfortable. But I could picture, something crammed so full you couldn't put another person in. But what does it mean to be so full of the presence of God that there's not room for a person to go in? And so God's presence fills the temple here in Solomon's day. And God's presence remains at the temple. This is the place that God says to Solomon, yes, when people look toward this temple and pray, I'll hear them in a special way. When you remember me out of your sin, and confess your sin, think of the way that I'm at this temple. I'll be faithful, I'll forgive your sin. So God's presence here is the sign that he's with Israel. And in Ezekiel, God's presence departs from the temple. This is very serious. If we thought coming up to this that what Jeremiah describes with the conquering of Jerusalem, with all of the people, north and south, Israel and Judah being carried off into exile, and the land being devastated and laid waste, if we thought that was serious, this is an order of magnitude bigger in terms of seriousness. If that was a 5 on the Richter scale, this is at least a 6 on the Richter scale in terms of significance. God's presence has left the temple. So what happened? How did it get to the point where the very people who were charged with maintaining God's worship, who were set apart for that, this is their job. This is what they're paid to do. This is their entire life and livelihood, is to maintain the temple worship of God. In this place that God has set apart, that God physically, his presence dwells in, how did he get to the point where these people treated this so shallowly, so cavalierly, that it not only didn't matter if there was worship of idols, but they were more concerned, as you look at this, they're much more concerned in this chapter about worshiping their idols than they are about anything related to God. That final scene, that culmination at the end where they turn their backs on the Creator and worship the creation. Could there be a more harsh way of doing this? Could there be greater evidence that they completely turned away from God and they don't care what God thinks anymore because they're so consumed with worshiping what they're going to worship? How does it get to that point? Ezekiel chapter 10 describes the glory of the Lord lifting from the temple. It's not long after this that the temple itself is destroyed. And we read about the rebuilding of the temple in Ezra and Nehemiah. There are some scholars, and there's a long tradition about this in Judaism that says, when we read about the rebuilding of the temple in Ezra and Nehemiah, when we read the prophets who lived during that time and after that time, we don't see a scene that's comparable to what happened in Solomon's day. We don't see the glory of the Lord ever returning to the temple. Now, I don't know if God's glory did or did not return to the temple. It is interesting that there's this echoing silence about that question in Scripture. Did God bless the temple in the same way that he had for Solomon? Did he dwell among the people in that same way? We're not sure. That temple too has been destroyed. All that's left of it is the western wall, sometimes called the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. That's all that's left of any temple in Jerusalem. But as we move into the New Testament, God does describe a place where his presence and his glory is supposed to dwell. In fact, God uses some of the same language that he used about the temple in the Old Testament for this place in the New Testament. And this place in the New Testament is here. In the New Testament, God promises his presence in the hearts of those who trust him. God promises his presence not in one specific city on one specific hill, but God promises his presence to be with us wherever we go. This again is much greater, much more significant than even the temple was. As New Testament Christians, we don't pray in any specific direction toward any specific place. We get in the Old Testament a description of Daniel praying toward the temple. We got in the dedication, Solomon said people should pray toward the temple. We don't have that. Because the place where God has chosen to put his presence, the place where God has chosen to dwell, is in the life of believers. Now, I hope some of you are connecting the dots here. I hope we were, appalled that these people who are charged with going into the presence of God, with going into the very center of the temple, to the presence of God, could bring into that presence of God the worship of sick, detestable idols. Could turn their back on God and worship the creation instead. These are the people who go into the holiest place that there is. Did you hear what happened in the New Testament? That temple, the inner court of that temple, the inner court of that where the Holy of Holies is, that place where God's presence dwelled in a special way, that his presence that wasn't anywhere else, that place in the life of a believer is in you. Kind of puts a different spin on Ezekiel 8, doesn't it? We can get really mad at these people who desecrate the temple. We can just shake our heads and say, how could you do that? Don't you know God's presence is going to be taken away from you? Don't you know there's going to be punishment because this is the place God chooses to dwell? How could you disrespect God and dishonor him in that way? What's happening in your temple? What's happening in your inner life? Are you a person for whom God is number one in all things, for whom the worship of God is consuming? Are you a person that manufactures idols in your heart? Are you a person that chases after the next thing when it comes at the expense of your pursuit of God? Are you a person who values other things in your inmost being more than God? I can answer that question. I can answer the question the same for all of us because I know the way that I have to answer it for myself. My heart is an idol factory. It churns out idols at an alarming rate. Everything, it seems, catches my attention. Not everything, but so many things stack up. I have good things that God would want me to value and pursue and put priority on. Then I do more than that. I go beyond what God intended and make those the most important things. And you do it too. How important is your family? Your family should be important to you, shouldn't it? God intends that family is an important thing, and if you have responsibilities toward your family, God intends that you keep those responsibilities, that you provide, that you love and care. Is your worth so wrapped up in your family that if God forbid it were taken away, that your life would be over? What about your work? What about God does intend us to find satisfaction in our work. That's clear from the very first chapters of the Bible. God does intend that we profit from our work. God does intend that we do work. In fact, God creates us as people who work. That's part of who we are from the very beginning. Is your life so wrapped up? Are your priorities so dictated by your work that your work commands whatever else happens in your life, by your work schedule, by your work priorities? Is your life so dictated by your work that if you were fired, if you lost your farm, if you lost your business, that everything else would be worthless and crushed? It's good to value things. When bad things happen, we're going to be sad. That's part of the package. But a good way to test is this becoming an idol to me, is to mentally put yourself through this. If this was taken away from me, would I be crushed? Would I be devastated? I heard another pastor speaking a few weeks ago about ministry in this context. He was speaking to a conference of pastors. He said, as you set out into ministry, especially if you're young, ministry is a big priority. He says, and ministry can become something that you put ahead of your devotion to God, ahead of following God. And he used that test again. If your ministry doesn't go right, if somebody is standing in your way in your ministry, he says, watch your reactions. Because you're going to be upset if somebody stands in your way. You're going to be sad when things don't go your way. But if somebody's in the way and you just need to crush them, and if something bad happens and you're just absolutely devastated, you've got to ask, what was the priority in the first place? Am I doing the thing that God called me to do? Or have I made the thing that God called me to do into my own God? This is the second time this year that something like this has happened. I told you earlier this year that I was preaching on a specific text in Nehemiah, and I had a friend call and say, hey, I'm going through this, and we talked about it for about an hour before it sparked in my mind to say, I'm preaching on that this week. The Bible has something to say about that. Well, again, just this week, I'm going through Nehemiah. I'm not going through Nehemiah this week. I haven't said Isaiah yet. Last week, Ezekiel was Isaiah. I had a very good time. But this week, I'm going through Ezekiel. I've got the sermon text picked. I can see what God's using this to tell Ezekiel, and I'm well on the way to seeing what God's what God's doing with this text to speak to me and to speak to us this morning. And I got a call from a high school student who said, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this activity that's been really important to me, and I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. And the student was just apoplectic almost about it as she was contemplating not being able to do this piece of what had been so important to her. And we talked about it for a while, and we went through it, and I said, get through today. That particular day was an important day. I said, get through today, and when you're through today, call me, because there's something else you need to think about. So she did. And this, what we're talking about this morning, is exactly what I told her. That's exactly where she was. I said, has this activity become too much for you? This activity is a good thing. I would encourage any high school student to do that activity if they wanted to. And to do it well and to work hard at it. But looking at the prospect that it would be snatched away, are you appropriately upset, or has it completely ruined your entire life? That's the standard here. But for Ezekiel, and for the people doing this idol worship in the temple, they didn't have to ask this kind of question, right? If you bring a statue into the temple of God and say, we're going to worship this statue within the temple, that's clearly out of bounds. And we can look at that and say, clearly, you should not do that. That's what you must avoid. And yet, we do it in a way that's more subtle. And we do it in a place inside of ourselves, in our inmost being, that we don't often bother to equate with the temple. We don't think of our inner thought life, our inner desires and motives as the place where God has chosen to dwell, as the place where God has chosen to put his glory. But it is. And I want to use this sermon this morning for us to say, God, is this something that we're guilty of? Are we too the people who set up idols within your temple? Are we too the people who ignore the Creator and worship some aspect of creation? And God forbid, if we are, and I've told you already, I am. If we are, would we be the people that when we see clearly what we're doing, that God has so changed our heart that we want to get rid of it right away? That God has so changed our heart that when we identify this idolatry, we don't celebrate it and continue it, we put it out. Would this morning be the catalyst for that? Would you look at your priorities? Would you see, what is it that I'm worshiping? Am I worshiping God? Have I put something else or a host of other things in God's place? And if you see something else in God's place, would this morning be the starting point for you taking out your hammer and metaphorically crushing those things inside of yourself that you put in God's place? I said earlier, the Bible in Chronicles says that as the people chased after these worthless idols, that they themselves became worthless. I don't want to be worthless. I want my life to mean something. I want my life to build up to something. I want to have a purpose. I want to have fulfillment. And you do too. And that's good, and that's healthy, and that's God-given. And the way to get that purpose and that fulfillment and to have your life mean something and not be worthless is pursue something worthwhile. Let me tell you, ultimately, the only thing worthwhile for us to pursue is God himself. So this morning, the ultimate goal is for us to look at ourselves and say, who am I pursuing? Where am I getting my value? And if need be, to refocus that pursuit on God himself and to have renewed strength and vigor to chase after God. Would God make it so for us this morning?